Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 11 of This Week in FCPA with myself and Jay Rosen for the week ending July 1st. In this episode, we take a look at the Brexit issues. We discuss the Analogic FCPA settlement in a little more depth, and we take a look at the Volkswagen emissions testing scandal settlement with the U.S. government. At the end, we talk about some of the significant deaths this week, including from the world of sports, Pat Summitt and Buddy Ryan, and from the world of music, Dr. Ralph Stanley and Scottie Moore. As usual, the episode comes in at just over 30 minutes. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to visiting with you again. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA for week ending July 1st. You may ask, why are we recording this, or why are you seeing this, or why are you hearing us on June 30? Well, it's because we're doing a special Thursday afternoon edition of This Week in FCPA with my good friend and colleague, Mr. Translations himself, Jay Rosen. Jay is back from what we would call a weekend in Las Vegas, solo with his wife. We can't wait to hear the details of that. But before we do, of course, we have to find out what the weather in It Never Rains in Southern California is like today. Welcome.
Thank you, Tom. We're looking at a nice dry heat of 95 degrees, constant all day, and Lotka the dog has to stay inside. So when he disagrees with anything I say, you might hear him pipe up in the background.
Well, fair enough. So are we still having our internal vacation of children free?
We are. The girls do not come back till the 4th of July. So it is incredibly quiet in this house. We are catching up on a lot of Game of Thrones. So we're almost at season 6. And we actually are going out with adults and having dinner. So it's a fun break, but we miss them dearly.
Well, I understand both concepts. Jay, we had, as always, an interesting week. Some of the things we wanted to talk about really started last week, but they have bled over this week in quite a big way. I think the biggest thing for me is what my wife would call Brexit, but what we call here in Texas, Brexit.
Well, in honor of that, I am drinking tea. You can see there's a tea bag in here. It's not PG Tips, it's Lipton. But I wanted to find my Who Union Jack shirt, but I couldn't find that. So I'm wearing a Red Sox jersey, drinking my tea, and thinking about 240 years ago, we claimed our independence, right?
Right.
So, Mr. Conspiracy Theory over here, is this the Brexit independence? And are our friends across the pond finally, 240 years later, getting what it's like to want your own freedom?
Well, I would only suggest that the shock of last Friday's vote was only overshadowed by the loss of the English national soccer team to Iceland Monday, a country with a population the size of Leicester City, 330,000. Knocked out the one of the favorites for the tournament, of course, the mother home of soccer. And so we actually had 2 Brexits in less than 4 days. So pretty demoralizing time for the English national soccer team. And certainly at Shea Fox, Mrs. Fox was in mourning. So at any rate, Jay, as you know, I had the opportunity to visit with Jonathan Armstrong, one of our good friends from across the pond. Jonathan is at the Cordery firm, and he's been able to visit with first with Leona Lewis on her podcast, Masters of Disaster, to talk about what his initial thoughts about Brexit might be. And then I was able to take a little bit of a deeper dive into what it might mean for compliance going forward. And I think we both felt that the laws of our respective countries would not be impacted. Obviously, the FCPA would not be, but he didn't think it would negatively impact the UK Bribery Act because that's obviously a UK law, and there is no EU general anti-corruption legislation. But he really pointed to a couple of things They may be within your purview, but certainly want to get your thoughts, and that's data privacy and data transfer. So as listeners may know, the Schrems decision last fall kind of threw data privacy into turmoil. We used to have something called a safe harbor that U.S. companies could utilize. That was thrown out. There's now a data privacy regime that's under discussion and debate in the United Kingdom, in the EU, but not yet formalized. And so we have what is privacy in the EU, and will that carry over to England and United Kingdom? I suppose we have to talk about Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales as part of this. They may have their own exits to join the EU. And then data transfer. And really the concern I have, Jay, is if data is private in the EU, will they allow it to be transferred to the United Kingdom, recognizing that would be a direct conduit to the United States? And at least the EU views data privacy as not as robust in the United States. So what is kind of your takeaways, or there are others?
Well, I think you lock on something that has been really at the forefront over the last several years. When we look at global FCPA investigations and prosecutions, there's been a lot more information sharing between the DOJ, the SEC, and other global agencies. So I think both you and Jonathan are really correct to lock onto that aspect there about how does data privacy move forward. So that's going to be something that I think we were all together at the last SEC conference when the Schrems decision came down. And, Jonathan's really been, at the forefront of that. Also this morning, I had the opportunity to listen into the securities docket webcast that they had celebrating the almost 5th year anniversary of the UK Bribery Act.
Tomorrow.
And so Barry Bevito was on it, Vivian Robinson, and then I will butcher Richard's last name, but what is it? Kovalevsky, Richard
Kovalevsky, QC.
So all those gentlemen, they really started off that they, a year ago they made predictions, and one of their predictions was that there would be no Brexit. So that kind of threw their opening remarks into limbo. And their feeling is that it won't really affect FCPA either, but they're looking into their crystal ball for next year, and they're seeing a lot more a rise in using a DPA going forward and trying to get more resolution that way. And our good friend, the FCA professor, chimed in to me on LinkedIn saying, well, what's the big deal here? They've had one prosecution in 5 years. And I said, well, Mike, I didn't make any reps and warranties as into the quality of the webinar this morning or what the SFO was going to do, but I was just putting it out there that people might want to listen to this. So I think where it all wraps back in is this is still yet to be determined. And I think if we want to really go into the weeds about what happened with the stay or leave vote, there's Article 50, which, since you're a lawyer, you could probably describe better. But I understand from my limited knowledge is that Prime Minister Cameron, we're not going to call him David, really made a very smart move by punting on this and allowing his successor to take a look at it. So as long as Article 50 hasn't been invoked, nothing's going forward at this point. And then once it does get invoked, there's at least going to be 2 years. So I think after the markets kick back in, it's going to be business as usual, but there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff between now and then.
And I guess the other point that I would want to raise is that Scotland now has to make some I think pretty important decisions on whether or not it stays as part of Great Britain or votes to disassociate itself and become an independent nation, because the EU has made clear that Scotland cannot be a part of the EU while it's a part of Great Britain, together with England. and Scotland has to decide if it is in Scotland's interest to stay with England and part of Great Britain or move to the EU. And if they do move to the EU, we put yet another border where one is not right now, recognizing they are separate countries, but there's free flow of goods, ideas, information, data across England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And if Northern Ireland also disassociates from Great Britain and either becomes an independent country or somehow associates with Southern Ireland, and wouldn't that be ironic if Britain exiting the EU is what unifies Ireland after all these years? It could be an interesting series of questions, and in particularly for Houston, with a large energy contingent in England and Scotland, in Aberdeen for North Sea work. 3/4 or 2/3 of the North Sea approximately is assigned to Great Britain right now. And I'm sure some portion of that would go to Scotland if Scotland pulled out of Great Britain. And that would set up yet another series of set of laws, potentially another Scottish Fraud Act or Anti-Bribery, Anti-Corruption Act. So lots of open questions there, probably more than we would know at this point. But still a lot of shock. What Prime Minister Cameron and the rest of the English government are going to do, who knows at this point. All we can say is what my wife would say: watch this space. So we had the Analogic FCPA enforcement action, and I think we touched on it last week, but there's been a lot more commentary this week. I was part of that commentary, and I thought it was a really interesting case for several reasons. Really, first and foremost, Jay, we had some, I won't even say bribery scheme. We had a complete, total corporate bribery program by Analogic's Danish subsidiary, BK Medical. And we had, and I say it was a program because it was set up at the highest levels, specifically including involvement by the BK Medical's chief financial officer. And it's rare we see that type of bribery program at that high level where the penalty was relatively minor. So we had Analogic with SEC penalty, and then we had a civil side, cease and desist order, and we had BK Medical with a non-prosecution agreement, not even a deferred prosecution agreement, meaning they didn't have to admit to criminal conduct. And Mark Bone and Ann Sultan, writing, they're both lawyers at Miller and Chevalier, writing in the FCPA blog, although based on a client memo they put out, said that there were 4 key areas of inquiry, and I'm going to have to go to glasses to read these. Number 1, high-level accounting failures. And as I would note, it doesn't get much higher than the CFO. We have the CFO specifically approving false invoices, false contracts, and false payments. We had unknown third parties who were paid. The bribery scheme detailed payment to known tax havens of unknown third parties. We had a really novel distributor overpayment scheme to generate funds, including the generation of not only fake invoices, but entire fake contracts. So,
and here's my favorite part: 2-time losers, right?
2-time losers. Number 4, as Mark and Ann said, conduct flagged twice over a 10-year period without being stopped. So, it's difficult to understand how a company could engage in such conduct and yet sustain a relatively minor fine and penalty. Certainly, the parent company, somebody was asleep at the wheel. And in the subsidiary, you can't get much more intentional than having the CFO sign off on fake contracts. But for the practitioner, at least from my perspective, the lesson is, once again, as reaffirmed in the pilot program, and then the Nortec and Academy declinations and SEC enforcement actions, you can make a heck of a comeback if you self-disclose, cooperate, and remediate. And what's even more interesting in Analogic, we had allegations of non-cooperation. They didn't, not only allegations of it, they didn't get credit for it. So the government is giving significant credit to companies that meet 3 of the 4 prongs, meaning self-disclosure, cooperation, remediation, and profit disgorgement. And if you hit all 4, I mean, maybe you're looking at a Nortec and Kami declinations, at least on the criminal side, and a minimal payment on the SEC civil side if you disgorge profits. So any thoughts on your end?
Well, I want to talk about the elephant in the room. Where's the individual accountability there?
Absolutely.
What's happening to the guy who came up with the great scheme?
So that was our CFO friend, Mr. Lars Frost. Now, Mr. Frost was identified as a Danish citizen. So query, did the U.S. government have jurisdiction over him? Could they extradite him? He did agree to a civil side SEC fine and penalty. He had been terminated from the company. And that's more than an 800-pound gorilla. That's a great question, particularly in light of the Yates memo. So I don't know how to reconcile it at this point. The other thing is the case basically took forever. I think the self-disclosures were made in 2011. So that's a long time, 5 years, even in the FCPA world, but still pretty significant settlement.
And earlier, before I got on with you, I caught up on that audio blog you had this week with the other 2 lawyers from Miller.
Right.
And you guys, right. And a couple of weeks ago, we touched upon that. So did they specifically address this case? Because what is it a 5-year window for the disgorgement?
Right. So I talked to Mark Bone and George Haney. George is a tax partner at Miller, and they had both independently written client memos. Mark, together with Ann Sultan on the previously mentioned memo on the Analogic case. But they had also written a memo on a decision out of the 11th Circuit called Graham. And Graham held properly that there's a 5-year statute of limitations on FCPA actions by the Securities and Exchange Commission. But more importantly is that profit disgorgement can only go back 5 years. And the significance is that the numbers of fines and penalties are more than a factor of 10 for profit disgorgement. So I think numbers over the past 5 years were approximately $850 million in profit disgorgement, $53 million in fines, and $50 million in prejudgment interest. So profit disgorgement is a huge part, and the SEC's position was that you would go back to the beginning of the conduct for the disgorgement of the profits, not a 5. And the court said, no, you can only go by 5 years. George Haney's memo was on an IRS tax ruling that said that profit disgorgement under some circumstances is not tax deductible. And it really got into the arcanacia of tax law and how profit disgorgement is characterized as a damage, whether it's based on the equitable remedy of profit disgorgement through equity, or because it's available to the SEC, it's a statutory remedy because it's written into the Securities Act by congressional enactment. So the significance is if a company says it is profit disgorgement, it may be not be able to take it as a tax deduction. But if it makes that concession and the SEC agrees, it may be only limited to 5 years going back. So Mark and I are going to explore that on a later podcast, but it's certainly going to make I think the decision, it gives you one more factor in the decision to self-disclose, and it certainly complicates factors in your settlement negotiations on how to characterize the fine and penalty with regard to the SEC.
So it's, I think we're at a very interesting inflection point, because in this first half of the year, we've gotten a couple of declinations. We've gotten these NPAs, but they may be creating more questions than answers. And it's, I hope you'll have some time to follow the link to the UK Bribery Act thing that I listened to this morning. And one of the things that I think Vivian Robinson was articulating, that there were 3 different settlements, and they may have been either Scottish or they may have been British, but in each of those different settlements, they paid like a 300% fine.
Right.
And one of the things that he brought up was similar to something that, Mara Sen has said with you before about, if the government doesn't know about what you've done, and if you're coming to them and you're self-informing on yourself, or whatever the proper term is, there should be a benefit there. And they were making the same argument that you was making, that there really is, what is the incentive to go forward? We're seeing now that you can potentially get a 50% reduction or a 30% or a 20%. And before, the calculus was a little bit different, but it just still seems to throw this all up in the air, that we're seeing instances now where people are getting rewarded for non-positive action with regard to, settling up or coming forward to the government. And I just want to see, we need to, each one of these rulings that comes out, they give us a few more tea leaves to read. But I still don't think we have a clear direction on which way this is going. And I think it's hard for companies to, decide which way they should come down on this when they have a decision to make.
Well, actually, I think it's a little clearer than that, and I'm going to be writing about this over the next couple of weeks. I think I've had to make a shift to how I evaluate these, particularly Analogic. The conduct was so bad and so pervasive, yet they got a really fabulous settlement. So something's changed. It actually started changing. If you think back to Parker Drilling, which has C-suite involvement in the bribery scheme, HP, which had multiple bribery schemes across multiple companies, systemic failures across the entire organization, yet both companies sustained or were able to obtain fines at 30% below the minimum guidelines suggested, fines suggested by the sentencing guidelines. So it really started that far back. I don't think any of us recognize the pattern, but I think there's a pretty clear pattern now that I think things have changed quite a bit, and it should change the calculus, or at least the discussion companies have, because I think what Mara articulated, I think that question's been answered. And Nortec and Akemi and now Analogic point to me that things are going in a new and very different direction. And it's not how bad did you screw up, it's what did you do after you found out about it. That's the key inquiry now.
Those McNulty questions, right?
The McNulty questions. What did you do to prevent it? What did you do to detect it? And what did you do after you found out about it? So we are, unfortunately, wow, we really ran through some time. We did have one other huge event, and probably for you California people, being that y'all are the tree huggers of the world, not like us here in the energy capital of the world in Houston, where we love all things to burn gasoline and diesel. We have Volkswagen, which agreed to settle with the United States government and the states for $14.7 billion to the U.S., which includes $10 billion to buy back cars, $2.7 billion in fines to the EPA, and $2 billion to promote zero emissions. We also had a settlement of $603 million to the 44 states, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. $50 million goes to Texas. Thank you very much. We will not be exiting the United States with that money. We will keep it here and spend it ourselves. And this was a civil settlement. Leslie Caldwell made clear that there are criminal investigations ongoing. So it still could be a long road to hoe. And as I said, I quoted Winston Churchill, that it's not the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning for Volkswagen, and see where they may go.
Does that settlement include South Korea and some of the...
No.
So it's just pure settlement with the U.S. government.
So we got a few more minutes, but I have an incredibly exciting announcement. I am just thrilled. I was contacted today by the New Yorker magazine, and I'm a finalist once again in the cartoon caption contest. So next week, go to the cartoon caption in the New Yorker and vote for your compliance evangelist, Tom Fox. This will be my second time as a finalist, and I am 1 for 1. I got the call today. So if you've ever entered the cartoon caption contest, you know what big news this is, and hopefully I will win again. So I was thrilled to get that call today. So hopefully, when you say and the envelope, please, in a couple of weeks, it will be me, and I will be posting the link that you can go to vote for me. It will go up Sunday for next week's voting, but was very thrilled to get that. And my wife and I are off to see Brian Wilson do Pet Sounds this weekend, and then go to the environs of Pueblo, Colorado. What about the Rosens?
The Rosens are still kind of taking it easy. We're going to get things ready for the girls to come back. And we have a traditional 4th of July picnic at the local park where they have fireworks. And speaking about Brian Wilson, some guy who claims he was a Beach Boy and played on some of the first several albums is going to be there playing with his band. I'll have to tell you offline what the guy's name is, but it's a nice day. You bring a picnic lunch, and cools down to about a very frigid 85 degrees, so you can enjoy yourself.
July 4th has always been one of my favorite holidays. We celebrate. Hopefully people will think a little bit about what it means to be an American. And I've got a really interesting blog post I'm going to put up on the 4th by a woman who was the high school valedictorian of her high school class. Her high school class was in a Japanese internment camp in 1944. And her high school valedictorian speech was what it meant to be an American. So I'm going to post the text of that speech. I found it incredibly powerful, from a woman who is essentially in captivity because her parents were from Japan, although she was an American citizen during World War II. So I hope everyone will think about, really what the 4th means, what we get to celebrate, and the freedoms we have here that perhaps other folks don't. With that, Jay, I hope.
We got 2 more minutes. Question for you. Anything that you got to say about Pat Summitt or Buddy Ryan?
We've lost some great people this week. I've been writing a week's blog post. My theme is the Battle of the Somme, which the centenary is tomorrow, and that's preoccupied me. That those 2 people were certainly very large, but here's the 2 I want to talk about. Ralph Stanley, one of the absolute founders of bluegrass in this country, died last Friday. And then 2 days ago, Scottie Moore died. Scottie Moore was the lead guitarist for Elvis Presley, and he played with Elvis starting at the Sun Sessions. So he was there from the beginning. And if you're a music fan, I got to see Ralph Stanley play. He was fabulous. It is bluegrass at its finest. So those are really the 2 I were thinking about. Buddy Ryan, I don't know what more you can say other than just Buddy Ryan. But kudos to the 85 Bears, the greatest team I ever saw. Pat Summitt, the greatest, I guess Gino Ariano is perhaps the greatest coach now, but she led the women's revolution in basketball. I'm old enough to remember having seen basketball where women couldn't play full court. It was 3-on-3 on each side. And she certainly led women's basketball out of that with some other coaches, Judy Conrad of Texas. But so I've been thinking about Scottie Moore and Dr. Ralph Stanley, who I'm going to write about next week. And those are my 2.
Well, if you get a chance, there's a great 30 for 30 on the 85 Chicago Bears.
Yes.
There's this wonderful visual that the defense is carrying Buddy Ryan off.
Right.
And the offense is carrying Ditka off. And you've never seen a Super Bowl like that where a team was so divided.
Right.
And there's this bit where I guess Buddy wrote a letter to all the people on the defense, and they basically came to his aid and lobbied George Halas to keep Buddy on in 1981. Right. And to see the emotion there from like Mike Singletary and Gary Fensick and these guys, that they were basically reduced to tears, and to show you how much love and emotion there really is. And, you know, people kind of discount football, and, you know, it's a gladiator sport and people are getting injured all the time and maimed for life. But these guys said if they had it to do again, they would go to war with Buddy. And, you know, I think that's the interesting part about football, is that those relationships that are formed within a locker room, they transcend time, and they bring people together for a common purpose. And I think that's what Buddy did with his defense.
Yesterday on, I think it was PTI, they said in the late 80s and early 90s, the 4 coaches in the NFL East were Bill Parcells, Jimmy Johnson, Buddy Ryan, and the coach of the Redskins, whose name just escaped me.
The racing car guy.
Yep. That guy. 4 Hall of Famer, near Hall of Fame coaches. So anyway, yes, great tributes to both. So till next week, Jay, it's been a pleasure to talk about This Week in FCPA.
All right. Good vibrations to you.